Welcome to the Amazing Studios Production Podcast. I'm Cliff Baumgartner.
And I'm Peter Scheibner.
How you doing, Peter?
I'm feeling like a weight has been lifted off my chest, Cliff.
Yeah.
I'm tired, but I'm also gratified at the end of a long week.
Yeah, we talked last week on the show about we were in production all last week, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here more in a minute. But we got the finals on that project sent off, about 10 o'clock this morning?
Yeah, after being here very late last night to get the color and all the final touches put in, we got the project done and delivered.
We came in at 5:30 yesterday, or 5. We were here at 5,
5
actually.
a.m. in the morning.
We were here at 5 a.m. and left at about 7:30.
Yep.
And we left with a pretty much completed project. So
Yep.
It's very successful. But, for it to be the week of Labor Day, we have labored quite a lot.
So I have an idea. Let's forego our traditional opening where we talk about movies, and let's actually just kind of recap this week for our audience. Let them know how this project kind of finished.
Because we've had no time to watch movies.
No, we haven't. I haven't watched anything in a week.
I've seen nothing except my eyelids and the back of a camera or a computer screen.
Or the back of a steering wheel for me driving to location.
Yeah, lot of driving. It's always nice when a shoot is just far enough away that it doesn't make sense to stay there, but not close enough for it to be a nice drive. Mm-hmm. It is just in that weird...
that 40-minute range.
That purgatory right there in the middle.
Right, where it's not quite an hour, so you're not going to spend the night, but it's also... Yeah, and that's what this week has been.
Yes,
a lot of
absolutely.
Driving.
We talked about last week, we were actually celebrating the fact, as of last Friday, that it was the beginning of the end. We had one more shot to get, and we would be done with production. How'd that work out?
So, actually, this is actually a kind of an interesting take on things. So we put a lot of work to pre-production on this thing. We spent a lot of time talking about that and how planning really helped. And we got that last shot Friday afternoon. Yep. We got it in. We even got a rough cut off Friday night. Yeah. We'll come back in Tuesday because of Labor Day this last weekend. Come in Tuesday, and we went for a sit-down meeting with the client to go over the cut, and there were new people there who had zero information about it, and they brought up some good points, points that we had been discussed in pre-production, and we decided to go one direction. Right. Ultimately, at the end of the rough cut review, it was decided that it needed to go in another direction, and that actually involved reshoots. Yep. Three of them.
Yeah, and it's important to say that this isn't, I wouldn't say it's anyone's fault, either the client's or ours. It's just a matter of, it's kind of the burden we have working in a visual medium. A lot of times, you just don't know how it's going to look until you see it on a screen. Yeah. Until you hear it with the music and you feel the emotion, and the emotion might be taken in a different way than you think, and that's what the problem ended up being, was that the emphasis at the end was in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. So that necessitated a full day of reshoots.
Yeah, and it wasn't, it's hard as an artist because it wasn't that the shot didn't work. I think we've all been in those situations where you almost feel like you're maybe trying to hide something, or you're trying to pull something over on the client. This was honestly, it's the shots that we had that had to be replaced were some of the best shots artistically we've ever gotten.
It's very solid. The whole piece was very solid.
Oh yeah, they're phenomenal shots. But I get the client's perspective in where the shot didn't quite. It carried on a stereotype that they didn't want carried on about themselves. Something that we couldn't have been aware of, not being as close to it as they are. But when they saw it, it fulfilled a stereotype that they didn't want. Right. And so we ended up having 3 reshoots. We reshot all of them yesterday. That was yesterday. Oh. Yeah, so our 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., we actually went in at 5 a.m. To refilm. The first shot was actually a part of a sequence that we had, and it was shaking up how it ended a little bit.
Right, we can say it involved someone running at dawn. So all the shots had to be gotten in that magic 20 minutes.
Right, and we had him start running at a cornfield. And that's where we filmed all of it last time, and beautiful shots. I mean, the scenery was perfect, but they didn't necessarily want that country feel to be how it ended. Right. So we had then to change the location of where he was running to finish it. So he started at the cornfield and then ended someplace else. Yeah. And then we had a transition shot in the middle, so we had to think of what's kind of in between. So we had to pick those up in the morning. Then we had to replace a person. So there was a particular person in one of the shots who's actually getting ready to leave the place where our clients are, and so they really didn't want to highlight him, and it wasn't really any fault of anybody. It was just kind of an oversight that he ended up in it.
Well, and it's also with the thing where with a project like this, a lot of times, a client is having to grab, when you're involving, teachers, they're having to grab someone who's available. And he was available at that moment, and it was just kind of what happened. And I don't think that's something we would have reshot had we not had other reshoots going on. The client was great about that, but it just turned out to work out where if we're gonna do it, let's go all the way. But the great thing, I think, and the kind of the lesson that we've learned from it is that we were able to do reshoots. That is something that even a few months ago would have been impossible for us because we wouldn't have had the team for it. I mean, we had 4 shoots yesterday, 3 of them on one project, 1 of them on a completely different project. Like you said, we were here early in the morning shooting. Then after that shoot,
I split off.
You split off, went to a completely different project.
A charity.
Yeah, you went to a completely different project, shot something entirely new and different. Meanwhile, I went back to the school, shot something almost as a second unit, went back, shot something completely different, and then
you came back here to the studio. Let's see, you got here back around 11, and you were here ongoing. I went back to the school then after my other shoot, and we shot a completely different scene. If you follow my Instagram, Peter the Director on Instagram, you'll see I've got a shot of myself with the Red and the Ronin in a river, filming some people, and so we got that sequence.
And if you have my Instagram, whereas Peter and Brandon were out in a creek battling beavers and mosquitoes, I was color grading and watching the Apple event.
And actually, Cliff had a very important job yesterday because we've had it on our calendar now for like a month that we were all going to sit down and watch the Apple event together.
We usually do here.
But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. So Cliff had an important job, and that was live texting the event. And so while we were in the middle of the shooting, I'd look down and I'd have 20 new texts giving me updates on, okay, this is what's new with the Apple TV, and here's what it does, and this is all pretty cool.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
That was hugely helpful.
I'm glad to be able to help.
So we shot that whole new sequence, came back, got everything in, retimed it with the music and the VO, got it all sweetened, and then we colored. We did 2 parts to the color. We did kind of the primaries and then the final. Talk to us about that process and how we kind of broke it up and all that.
Yeah, well, we were fortunate to have, because these were just reshoots, and the bulk of the piece, I would say 70% of the piece remained the same. It was just that 30% that we had to kind of move around and mess with. So while you were out that afternoon, when I said I was color grading, I was actually doing all of the primary color, our first pass color, on the entire piece, so that when you came back, we only had 2 shots to worry about, and then we were ready to do a full grade. And then we actually spent a few hours here. It didn't take as long as we thought, which was really great. For anyone in the editing community, you probably know that Adobe Premiere recently, they did their update, their big 2015 update, and in that they included Lumetri Color. They expanded Lumetri Color inside of Premiere, and there's now this really great workspace and this really intuitive color grading suite of sorts inside of Premiere. It's all like speed grade, but directly inside of Adobe Premiere, and that's what we were able to use, and that made the process a lot faster, because there was a time where you told the client we'd have a cut by midnight, and thankfully we were out here at 7:30. So I mean, it really sped us up more than we expected, because it's the first project we've used that particular workflow on.
And I'm so much more used to, when you go into color, it's this big process. You're gonna take certain clips, you're gonna export them out to After Effects, so you can go and you can do all your masks. That's the only place you can do your masks. And then you're gonna take certain clips into speed grade, which means you're going in and out of programs, and at the very end you're going to take the whole thing to Resolve and do your final grade, and then you send it out. But really, what would normally have taken us probably 2 days took us 4 hours last night of really dedicated, focused time.
And it's one of those things I always wish for color, because color is such an important process. I always wish we had more time with it, but in the end, Adobe's tools allowed us to do a lot in a very limited period of time, and enabled us to get what we call here a draft final, which is nearly the final piece. It is, for all intents and purposes, a final, just awaiting client approval. We got that off last night, and as of this morning, we had approval, and the finals went out, and it will be hitting this video will be hitting the road next week.
Yep.
And also hopefully online some point next week, so we can actually we can sit down and talk about it, and also we can share it out. So be sure to be following us. As Peter mentioned, he's on Instagram at Peter the Director. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and everywhere else as Cliff Baumgardner or at Cliff Baumgardner, and then Amazing Studios. You can look us up. We're Amazing Studios 1 on Twitter. Or you can go to our website, amazingstudiosinc.com. We see a whole bunch of stuff. We actually right now have a blog post up about a really cool piece we did recently that our art team did.
Oh, yeah, that was a great post.
Yeah, for First Bank. First Bank of local First Bank of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, I believe. And it was this great animated television commercial broadcast spot.
Jeremiah directed that one, right?
Yes, he did. And
Yep.
he wrote a piece all about how he organized and planned and ultimately executed a very complex motion graphic piece in, I think, about 3 weeks. From beginning to end. So it was really awesome. But yeah, so let's go ahead and hop into our main subject this week. Last week, we were talking all about production, and we're doing it a little bit this week. We wanted to kind of take a step back, and we realized there's something we've never done here on the podcast, and that's give our origin stories.
Yeah.
How did we get to where we are? How did we get into this field? And ultimately, how did we land here? I know for me, I was bitten by a radioactive spider.
And I was dropped into a radioactive vat of waste.
Yeah, exactly. Great origin stories. We were talking about this earlier, and everyone was sad because we don't have as good of an origin as Batman. But
Yeah. Well, except, you did fall into a well and were attacked by cameras.
Yes.
And your father had to rescue you, and he said something like, the lights will help to illuminate the darkness or something that inspired
that's
you.
why I can't look at Panasonics to this day.
Yeah.
They're a superstitious and cowardly lot. So why don't you kick us off? How did you get started in this whole weird world that we are in?
Well, for me, my story is very different than most artists. I did not grow up in an artistic family at all. I was military brat and lots of travel. I loved reading. I loved history. And my family was really your traditional American family. We loved baseball, football. I didn't know what a hipster was growing up, and I wouldn't have recognized one if I saw one. And
now you work with a bunch.
And now I work with a bunch. So I'm actually probably the outside man in the studio here, in that I'm the least artistic in the artistic senses of it. But so when I approached it, my origin, it kind of comes from a little bit more of raw discovery. I wasn't trying to express myself. I wasn't trying to, figure out my art form or anything like that. I just started discovering I loved stuff. So the first time I ever used a camera, I was 8 years old. My folks were taking a trip to Israel, and my grandparents had paid for my older sister and I to go with them. And my parents bought me a wound and click disposable film camera.
What we still shoot on to this day, believe it or not.
Yeah, actually, that's this project we just wrapped up.
Yeah.
Completely shot on disposable cameras.
If you're thinking about hiring us, that's a joke.
I hope people understand that.
I hope so too, but we got to be careful.
So
Disclaimers.
They got two cameras, one for me, one for my sister. I went through all of my pictures in a day, and my sister took none. And we were there for 8 days, and by day 6, she'd taken like 2. And so I ended up begging her to let me have her camera so I could take pictures. And I just realized I love taking pictures. So after that, we got back. I would buy a disposable camera every week. I'd buy the big packs of them, and I mowed lawns and I sold lemonade. I did whatever I could to make money, and I would spend my money to buy disposable cameras because that was the best cameras you could get.
Do you still have any of those photos?
I actually do have. My mother has a bunch of them. They're all in old scrapbooks now.
That's cool.
So when I was, I guess, 13 or 14, I wanted to save up to buy a digital camera. Digital cameras were new. There was one particular, it was a Fuji 4 megapixel camera, and that was huge, and it was $400 to buy.
Wow.
It had 18x optical zoom, and that was, it was huge. And so I saved up forever to buy that camera, and I bought my first digital camera. And I'm still in this mind thinking photography, and I'm not thinking of it as a living. I'm not thinking of this as anything. I'm not even taking good pictures.
Yeah.
I just loved it. I just loved taking pictures. It was fun. So I bought this digital camera, and I took pictures of everything. And one day I was taking pictures of little green army men. And I realized that if you take two pictures that are close together and you flip back and forth really fast, it looks like they're moving. And I thought, well, hey, what if I did like 10 pictures in a row? Oh, hey, look, I can make him walk across the table. Well, what if I did like a whole bunch of army men and I did like, 1,000 images? And at this point, I discovered Windows Movie Maker. And I realized I could drop all my photos in and make them exactly one frame each. And I could move through them super fast. And I started making these huge sweeping camera motions, and I'd make all kinds of effects, in-camera effects. And I was learning, I was discovering, and this was long before I ever realized, this was probably a couple of years before I realized stop motion was actually a thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm laughing at. I love the idea of you as a kid just being like, why has no one ever done this?
I know.
This
and then
is
I found out
amazing.
that a bunch of my favorite films like Wallace and Gromit and all that were actually stop motion films. But for me, it was raw discovery. And that's what I started falling in love with. It wasn't the artistic nature of what we do. It wasn't the expressionism of what we do. It was the discovery. Mm-hmm. It was the fact that I could actually, on my own, take something that nobody in my sphere of influence, my family, my friends, nobody in my sphere of influence knew or understood, and learn and push it and try new things. And so I started then exploring options in video, and I started realizing this whole world of video, and I started looking at different editors for my stop motion, and then I saved up and I bought two things at the same time. I bought Pinnacle for editing, and I bought a Canon Vixia, which I think we've talked about on previous episodes in our history of cameras. And I saved up, I bought that camera, and I started doing just small little video things. It was a mix. I would do some kind of fun stuff, and you and I were talking about it earlier. Maybe at some point we'll go and show some of our old films. But I had this ongoing series. I had a friend, my best friend's name was Chucky Baker, and we had a series called Agent Baker. And Agent Baker was a former CIA agent who was disavowed by the agency and had to go rogue. And
Is there any chance that this was around the time of Mission Impossible?
no, actually, this is several years after Mission Impossible.
Because it sounds like maybe this is then the first time you saw Mission Impossible. They sound awfully similar.
Yeah, so the storylines were nothing alike, but it was these shoot 'em up, almost Grindhouse style pieces.
Which is funny to imagine you doing that.
Can you even imagine?
No.
I mean, they were very, very, as I watch them now, pretty morbid. I do a lot of fluff pieces now, but those are pretty morbid. But we had fun. I would do those, and I did some, small local commercials. By the time I was 16, I was starting to get hired for things. And at this point, I knew nothing about aesthetic. Again, I'm not an artist at this point. I knew nothing about aesthetic. I knew nothing about composition. I really stumbled across these things. And it would be, I would make things, and I'd look then later as I started going to school and I started to understand, oh, that's why I was doing that. It just kind of makes sense. And a lot of it is, your influences. We've talked in the past about our influences and, Tarantino and such. I would naturally do what I'd seen, not even realizing that I was doing it because I'd seen
Or
it.
that there was a reason for it.
Right, like for instance, thinking in thirds on the frame and leading lines of action and the action axis. Action axis is actually a really funny thing. I go back and I watch some of my old work. My action axis was really good, and I wasn't even thinking in terms of an action axis. And so I started, I guess when I was 17 or 18 is when I really started discovering that I actually had an artistic side to me. And I started doing film more as expression than as discovery. While still to this day, the thrill of discovery, the thrill of building rigs, and the thrill of getting the shot that I've never seen before, those things they still excite me. There's also now a component of this that is an expressive side. It is this is how I interpret the world, and I'm going to share that with you. But really, to an extent, that's a smaller part of the art that I do. A couple years ago, I had a plane ride and I was riding with this guy who works for a film company. We just got seated next to each other. He works for a film company in Chicago that does a lot of their big thing is, oh shoot, what is it called? When you do screens, like split screens and all of that, projection mapping.
Oh, okay.
They're really big projection mapping artists, and he was an incredible artist. He had some incredible custom tattoos he'd drawn. His art book was out in front of when I sat down, and he was sketching these incredible ink artwork.
Wow.
So one of those guys, instant artist. You walk down, you sit next to him, you're like, oh my word, this is an artist. And I sat next to him, and I engaged him. We talked for the whole 3-hour flight, and he said something profound that I've taken with me, and I think this is kind of how my origin story ends at this point. This brings me to where I am today. He said there are two types of artists in the world. There are Leonardo DiCaprio's, and there are Michelangelo's.
Leonardo DiCaprio?
Sorry. Leonardo da Vinci's. Okay, that's actually, quick pause. That's actually an old joke in my family that I get tripped up in. My sister once stood up in front of all of us and said, who do you think, after an art project that she completely failed, and she said, who do you think I am, Leonardo DiCaprio? Which, of course, we then, just like you, all lost it. And that's kind of been our inside joke, and occasionally it slips out on me. Da Vinci. There are Da Vinci's, and then there are Michelangelo's.
Yeah.
And Leonardo da Vinci created all his own work. He did his own art. He didn't care what other people wanted. He didn't care what other people needed. He just did it because that was him. Mm-hmm. Michelangelo didn't make any original art. All of his art was art that he was hired to do by his patrons, typically the church. And his art was designed to make somebody else fulfilled. Mm-hmm. To an extent, that's my art. Here at Amazing Studios, and a lot of the work that I do my best work, and I do my most artistic work when I'm inspired by somebody else, which is probably in a lot of ways why I make a halfway decent, why I gravitate towards director of photography, is I'm really good at making other people's vision come to life. And that's kind of where my story has ended up, and it's a continual development. There's a lot of steps in there. It was almost 2 years ago now. It'll be 2 years ago this next month, actually, that I stumbled across Mike and ended up here at Amazing Studios, and what an incredible opportunity that was. Being able to come in originally as a production manager, and then moving into the director position now, and being able to have my own team that I get to work with every single day and interact with, and developing ideas, and being surrounded by what I consider real artists, people that were artists when they were 5, and not guys like me who kind of discovered their artistic side through experimentation and through time, and my story will continue to develop. I hope I can predict some of it, but I couldn't have predicted where I am today, and I never dreamed, at 12 years old with my little wind-up cameras that would evolve into what I do every single day, and what I love, and I don't think anybody would have predicted it if they'd known me when I was that age. Yeah. But when you look at it now in hindsight, it seems like the perfect progression.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. How about you?
My earliest days are actually similar to yours. It's interesting to hear you say that, because I also don't come from a particularly artistic family. Most of the people in my family are either in public service, so a lot of firemen, a lot of medical people, a lot of cops.
Yeah, your dad was a cop, right?
Yeah, my dad was a sheriff here in Wake County, North Carolina for 28 years. And my mom was in medical work, still is technically in medical work. She works for a medical company now. But the other side of my family were engineers. Actually, this is a fun fact for everyone listening. You see this a lot in movies when they want to show someone arriving at work. How do they often do it? They show them punching in on a time clock, right? In movies when you see those really iconic, big, green time clocks.
Yeah, the one with the car that goes cha-ching.
Yeah, exactly. My grandfather helped create that.
Whoa.
He helped design one of those time clocks.
So your grandfather is responsible for every single Edgar Wright film.
Exactly. My grandfather has been in more movies than I ever will be, if you believe that an artist is carried through his work. Yeah. And that's kind of the background of my family. A lot of mechanics, a lot of all people who either worked with their hands.
So kind of blue collar.
Right. Very blue collar or service oriented. I'm really the first person in my family to have the a crazy idea like, hey, I want to tell stories for a living. And but that started when I was really young. I gravitated. I look at it now. I didn't realize it then, but I always gravitated to stories. I loved movies. I loved TV. I would watch a movie and then I would recreate it with my action figures. Mm-hmm. Because that was what I wanted to do. I loved the stories and I loved figuring out, oh, I could make this better if I changed this, or I could do this. And I was doing all this stuff. I had no clue that it was all storytelling.
And in all your plot lines, things were much more likely to blow up.
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah. Of course. And they still are, to be fair, in the stuff that I write now. But my earliest kind of, when I first sort of got into film was, again, I was, from the time I've been about 12, 13, I started to realize that I had a love of writing. Specifically. Still didn't necessarily relate it to fictional storytelling so much. I started writing, I wrote some like short stories and stuff, but where I really started kind of taking off was in essay and journalistic writing. Mm-hmm. When I was 16, I actually got a job writing for an international magazine and wrote for a couple of years as a columnist there, and really started developing my skills as a writer. Got to work with a great editorial team who kind of put me through the paces, and this is where I sort of paid my dues and really started to identify as a writer. But even then, I didn't associate that with film at all. I loved movies. I had always been kind of fascinated with the technical side of things. Like I loved looking at pictures of how they did something, but the two never really met. Until I was probably about the same time, when I was about 16, I started getting into cameras and computers at the same time. It was just something about the technology. It was kind of at that time where Final Cut Pro 7 was what everybody was using, and everybody was super into it.
I always forget how much older I am than you.
I know.
I was using Final Cut 2.
Yeah. Well, 7 is kind of that time where everybody started, like, it became like the buzz thing. Because
that was the last iteration before they went to X.
Right. They kept it forever. Mm-hmm. But everybody was talking about the Final Cut Studio and everything that you could do. And I remembered seeing this online, and it was just intriguing to me, and I started getting into it. And the idea of being able to shoot something and take it into a computer and manipulate it and edit it and create and produce something was really intellectually interesting. But I still wasn't associating it with art. And it wasn't until I had been kind of into it for a little while and experimenting that, and I don't really have a moment, unfortunately, to recall. It wasn't like, some people have the story of, oh, when I saw this movie or when I read this book, that's when I knew. But for me, it just, at some point I realized, oh wow, this thing that I've been doing for years with writing and this filmmaking, storytelling world, they're really one and the same. They all use a lot of the same muscles, and I started kind of putting them together. But primarily, even then, as a writer, I shot stuff and edited stuff because I had to, because there was nobody else around to do it, so I did it. But I was always coming at it from a writer's perspective. I ended up going to college originally to get a film degree because I thought, well, I can learn writing from books. I can't learn film necessarily from a book. I need to go get a camera. I need to have access to crew and go do it. I got accepted to the Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia and dropped out. Completely failed. Just, it didn't work out for me. I was bad timing and I left. So technically, I'm a film school dropout.
Hey, congratulations.
I know. Ended up coming back home and trying to figure out, well, what the heck am I going to do? And I went back to writing again, something I'd always loved, something that had been there, kind of been running concurrently with what I had always done, but I had never allowed myself to think I could actually make it a career. Because when you see a film crew working or you see something that's produced, it feels more physical than something like, well, I'm going to come up with a story in my head and write it down on paper and somebody else is going to make it. I always thought, well, film is something I can do, being a writer is something I can't accomplish. But I was at a point where film hadn't worked out, so I went and I ended up getting a degree in writing. Oddly enough, the school I went to, the program I ended up in, because it was the most fitting for me, was a focus in screenwriting. So while I was in school, I actually, and my mom loves to remind me of this, I hated screenwriting. For like the first 2 years I was in school, I was only in school for 2.5, but the first year I just hated it. Every time I had a screenwriting project, I would just cuss about it and just, oh, this is awful. And then at some point, we were assigned to read Little Miss Sunshine, the script for Little Miss Sunshine by Michael Arndt. and who's also he's an Oscar winner for Little Miss Sunshine, but he also wrote, he also wrote Toy Story 3, he wrote Oblivion, he wrote Hunger Games Catching Fire. He was assigned on Star Wars Episode 7, actually, but didn't end up writing that script. But I read Little Miss Sunshine, and it was the first time I had ever been brought to tears by a screenplay. And it changed everything. And it really made me feel like, okay, I love writing, I love telling stories, I love filmmaking. I can actually bridge these worlds now. I see how I can bring these worlds together. And I started screenwriting. I started spending a lot of my time reading, researching, reading scripts, reading books, researching, watching more and more movies, trying to dissect scripts, dissect them from a storytelling perspective. And by the time I had gotten out of school, I had written a feature screenplay that I'm still trying to get made, but I had actually done it, and it was a really incredible achievement for me. But the thing I guess I didn't realize is the whole time I've been doing this, because my focus had been on storytelling, and I hadn't been saying, well, I want to be a director, or I want to be a DP, or I want to be an editor. I had been flexing all the right muscles to do all of those things, but I hadn't been thinking about it. So then by the time I got out of school, I had the skills to understand how to best tell a story through an edit, how to best tell a story as a director, how to, I don't consider myself the greatest DP, but how to tell a story using a camera. All of those were skills that were being driven by my simple desire and urge to just tell stories. And it's interesting to me because, like you said, I also don't consider myself a true artist. I'm very isolated, I think, in my art. I'm the opposite of you in that I benefit from just sitting and taking time in my own head and creating something. And I'm not the kind of person who can just sit down and create something at a moment's notice. I need time and I need focus, and it's kind of deeply personal in the way that I'm learning my creative process works and all that. But through doing all that in school and through studying screenwriting and everything else, I ended up kind of making myself into a filmmaker without realizing that's what I was doing. And when I got out of school, I actually wasn't out of school very long when I found the job here and applied. And since coming here, I mean, it's been it's been the best kind of film school you could ever have. It's just doing it and living in it and immersing yourself in it every day and being around other people who do it. So for me, I think it all comes back to just at my core, I'm a storyteller. And however I can do that, that's what I want to do. That's why I enjoy doing this podcast, because I feel like it's an extension of that. I feel like that's an extension of what we do. I feel like that's a real strong suit of what we do here at the studio, is that, when we get a project for a university, for example, what we've been working on in the last week, we don't just look at it as, okay, how can we get their message across? How can we make the best call to action? We all come at it from a perspective of how can we tell a story that's going to stick with people. Mm-hmm. And I think what my kind of origin has taught me is that that's what it all comes back to. And at the end of the day, that's what's most important. It's not about, even though for me, I might have started out thinking, oh, it's really cool to use a camera. It is really cool to use a camera, and I love doing it. But it only matters if you're doing that to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And as we say every week on the podcast, to actually craft a story that's worth hearing, that's worth experiencing, that is worth putting out into the world, and hopefully being able to impact someone's life or even just make them laugh for a few minutes. And I think that's an incredible power that we have through the art that we make. We get to affect people we've never met and will never meet. Mm-hmm. And yet they're laughing or they're crying or they're thinking about something because of something we put out in the world. And I think that is, for me, at the end of the day, what it all comes down to is finding and telling that story.
The work that it took to get to where you are has all been worth it.
Right. And it's still, and I think the most exciting thing is, we're talking about our origins today, but the truth is I still feel, and I think you would say you do as well, like it's all really beginning. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like...
This is the origin of chapter 1.
Oh, right, exactly. The maybe even the prologue.
I hope it's the prologue.
Yeah, I mean, and it's that thing of... I've always loved that the bassist for Red Hot Chili Peppers, Flea, once said, "The day I stop learning is the day I stop doing this." Mm-hmm. And I think that's the greatest thing about it, is for us, for if you have to come into work every day and do something, to be doing something that you're constantly learning about and growing in, it's just phenomenal. I mean, it's the most fun thing you could ask for, I think.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about us. We'd love to hear from you guys to where you are, where you're currently at in your career, and how you got there.
Yeah.
You know, are you a budding filmmaker? Have you been working here for 20 years? If so, we'd like to learn from you.
Yeah, and hit us up if you heard something in this and you're like, hey, I'm inspired by that, or hey, I want to learn more about that.
Right.
You can hit us up on our Instagram, our Twitter accounts. Probably tweeting us is the best way.
Yeah.
But we'll set it up. We'll have a conversation with you about steps that you can take if you want to get into this field or this art form. We can share from our experiences,
And we want to learn from you too.
Yeah,
because
we'll pick your brain.
Yeah, always. It's an experience, and we I think we feel very lucky to have a bunch of people who we get to do this with, both here at the studio and our clients, and people everywhere, and it's all one big community, and that's what we love about it. So, and also just so you guys know, if you do keep an eye on our Twitter or any of our accounts, you can get little special bonuses. Like, for example, this week we are actually live streaming the recording of this podcast a day early, so a day before anybody else is going to hear it, on Meerkat. So yes, we have
waving to the camera right now.
My phone is set up at the end of the table. So follow us, come and follow us for little surprises like that. And also we always are posting from the newest jobs that we're on and the various gigs and things that we're doing. A lot of gearhead photos because we're nerds.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun. So that's another extension of the community that we really enjoy. So as Peter said, he's Peter the Director on Instagram. I'm at Cliff Baumgardner. Pretty much everywhere else, and Amazing Studios is the company, and you can find us again at our website. It's at Amazing Studios 1 on Twitter. I apologize, and AmazingStudiosInc.com. And we have, like I said, we have blogs, we have constant behind the scenes updates and everything. So there's plenty to follow along with. But until next time, for the Production Podcast, I am Cliff Baumgardner,
and I'm Peter Scheibner, reminding you to craft a story worth hearing.